Clive Davis sat across from Whitney Houston in the Arista Records conference room and delivered a verdict that would shatter 15 years of trust. "This album will end your career." He wasn't being dramatic. He was being honest. The demo tape Whitney had just played for him was unlike anything she had ever recorded. Raw, unpolished, dangerous. It threw away everything they had spent 15 years building together. And Clive Davis, the man who had never been wrong about music, was certain this was the biggest mistake of Whitney's life. But what Clive didn't know was that Whitney hadn't come to ask for permission. She had come to fight for her soul. And over the next 8 hours, these two legends would engage in a battle that would test everything they believed about music, success, and artistic truth. By the time the sun set over Manhattan, one of them would be proven wrong. And the album they argued about would go on to sell 11 million copies and redefine what Whitney Houston could be. New York City, March 1998. The conference room on the 47th floor of Arista Records was designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan, gold records lined the walls, and in the center sat a table that had witnessed some of music history's most important decisions. But nothing that had happened in this room before would compare to what was about to unfold over the next 8 hours. Whitney Houston walked through the door carrying something that would change everything. In her hands was a demo tape, but this wasn't just any collection of songs. This was her manifesto, her declaration of independence, her truth. For 15 years, she had been America's sweetheart, the voice that could make angels weep. But now, at 34 years old, she was about to fight for something more important than hit records. She was about to fight for her soul. Clive Davis sat at the head of the table, the man who had discovered her, shaped her, and turned her into the biggest-selling female artist of all time. He had the instincts of a prophet when it came to music, and those instincts had made both of them incredibly wealthy. But today, those same instincts were about to put them on opposite sides of a battle that would test everything their relationship had been built on. The seeds of revolution. To understand what happened in that conference room, you need to understand the pressure cooker Whitney's life had become. Since her self-titled debut in 1985, she had lived inside a carefully constructed image. The girl next door with the voice from heaven. Pure, wholesome, untouchable. Clive had built this image deliberately, positioning Whitney as the perfect crossover artist who could appeal to everyone. But Whitney Elizabeth Houston was never as simple as that image suggested. Growing up in Newark, New Jersey, she had been surrounded by gospel, soul, and R&B. Her mother, Cissy Houston, was a soul legend who had sung backup for Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley. Her cousin was Dionne Warwick. Music wasn't just in Whitney's blood, it was her blood. And the music in her veins was rawer, more complex, more real than what she'd been allowed to show the world. By 1997, Whitney had recorded 7 multi-platinum albums, sold over 200 million records, and won countless awards. She had achieved everything an artist could dream of achieving, but something was eating at her, growing stronger with each perfectly polished ballad, each carefully orchestrated public appearance. She felt like a performer playing a role rather than an artist expressing her truth. The turning point came during a private moment at her home in New Jersey. Whitney was listening to the radio, flipping through stations, when she heard the new generation of R&B artists. Mary J. Blige's raw emotion, Lauryn Hill's fearless authenticity, artists who weren't afraid to show their imperfections, their struggles, their real selves. Whitney turned off the radio and sat in silence for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called her husband, Bobby Brown. "I need to make the album I've always wanted to make," she told him. Bobby, who had faced his own battles with being authentic in the music industry, understood immediately. "Then make it," he said simply. That conversation was the beginning of everything that would culminate in that conference room with Clive Davis. Over the next 4 months, Whitney worked in secret. She reached out to producers who specialized in the hip-hop soul sound that was dominating urban radio. She wrote lyrics that reflected her real experiences, not the sanitized versions she'd been presenting for years. She experimented with her voice in ways she never had before, letting it get gritty, letting it show emotion without restraint. The result was 14 tracks that sounded nothing like any Whitney Houston album before. There were hip-hop beats, raw production, lyrics about real struggles, real love, real pain. This wasn't the Whitney who sang "The Greatest Love of All." This was Whitney Elizabeth Houston from Newark, singing her truth without apology. When the demos were finished, Whitney knew she had created something powerful. But she also knew that what she was about to do was incredibly risky. She was essentially asking to throw away a 15-year brand and start over. She was asking her mentor, the man who had made her a star, to trust that she knew better than he did about what her next move should be. She was prepared for resistance. What she wasn't prepared for was just how fierce that resistance would be. Whitney arrived at Arista Records at 10:00 a.m. on that March morning. She was dressed casually, jeans and a simple top, no makeup artist, no stylist, no entourage. This was deliberate. She wanted Clive to see Whitney Elizabeth Houston, not Whitney Houston the brand. She carried the demo tape in a simple plastic case. No fancy packaging. No presentation materials, just the music. Clive greeted her warmly as always, but Whitney could see the curiosity in his eyes. She had been mysterious about why she needed this meeting, only saying that she had something important to play for him. As they settled into the conference room, Whitney noticed that Clive had invited 2 of his top A&R executives to join them. This annoyed her slightly. She had wanted this to be a private conversation, but she understood Clive's thinking. He wanted witnesses to whatever was about to happen. "So," Clive said with that slight smile he always wore when he was excited about new music, "what do you have for me?" Whitney took a breath and pressed play on the stereo system. The first track started, and immediately the room's energy shifted. The beat was harder than anything Whitney had ever recorded. The production was raw, unpolished in a way that was clearly intentional. And when Whitney's voice came in, it was different. Still powerful, still technically perfect, but infused with an edge, a realness that had never been present on her previous records. Clive's expression remained neutral as the first song played, but Whitney could see his fingers tapping on the table. Not in rhythm with the music, in agitation. When the song ended, she immediately started the second track before anyone could speak. This one was even more radical, a collaboration with a hip-hop producer that featured a rap verse and Whitney singing in a register and style she'd never used on her albums before. 3 songs in, Clive held up his hand. "Stop the tape!" Whitney pressed pause. The silence in the room was deafening. Clive stood up and walked to the window, his back to Whitney. The 2 A&R executives exchanged glances but said nothing. For what felt like an eternity, no one spoke. Finally, Clive turned around. His expression was unlike anything Whitney had seen from him before. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something worse. It was disappointment mixed with disbelief. "Whitney," he said slowly, carefully choosing his words. "What is this?" Whitney felt her heart racing but kept her voice steady. "This is my album. This is what I want to record next." What happened next would later be described by one of the A&R executives as the most intense meeting I've ever witnessed in 30 years in this business. Clive Davis did not raise his voice. He rarely did. But over the next hour, he methodically explained to Whitney why everything she had just played for him was wrong. "You've spent 15 years building something that no other artist has," Clive began, packing the room as he spoke. "You're not just a singer, Whitney. You're an institution. You represent something to millions of people around the world. This," he gestured at the stereo, "this throws all of that away." Whitney tried to interject, but Clive held up his hand. "Let me finish. I know what you're thinking. You want to be authentic. You want to show a different side of yourself. I understand that impulse. But authenticity doesn't pay the bills when no one wants to hear it." He pulled up sales data on the screen at the end of the room, showing Whitney's previous album's performance. "Every album you've made has outsold the one before it. You're on an upward trajectory that most artists would kill for. And you want to risk all of that for what? To sound like every other R&B artist out there." Whitney felt anger rising in her chest. "Every other artist. Clive, have you listened to what's actually happening in music right now? The sound is changing. If I don't change with it, I become irrelevant." This sparked a debate that would rage for the next 7 hours. They argued about artistic integrity versus commercial viability. They argued about what Whitney's fans expected versus what Whitney needed to express. They argued about risk versus reward, about evolution versus revolution, about staying true to a brand versus staying true to yourself. At one point, around 2:00 p.m., Clive made a statement that cut Whitney to her core. "I discovered you singing in a church in Newark. I saw something in you that no one else saw. I shaped every aspect of your career, from the songs you sang to the clothes you wore to the way you presented yourself to the world. I created Whitney Houston." The The room went silent. Whitney stood up slowly, her eyes locked on Clive's. "No," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "God created Whitney Houston. My mother raised Whitney Houston. I became Whitney Houston. You helped guide my career, Clive, and I'm grateful for that. But you didn't create me." This was the turning point in the conversation. The dynamic in the room shifted from mentor-student to something more equal, more adult. Clive seemed to realize he had crossed a line. He sat down, and when he spoke again, his tone was different, softer, more vulnerable. "You're right," he admitted. "I'm sorry, that was arrogant of me to say." But then he leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "But Whitney, please understand what's at stake here. If this album fails, and I believe it will, it doesn't just hurt you. It hurts everyone who has invested in your career. The people at this label who depend on your success. The fans who have supported you for 15 years. Whitney sat back down, feeling the weight of responsibility he was placing on her shoulders. But she also felt something else. Certainty. She knew what she had created was good. More than good. It was necessary. "Clive," she said, "what if you're wrong?" He looked at her with surprise. In all their years working together, she had rarely questioned his judgment so directly. "What if this is exactly what people want to hear from me? What if staying in the same box is actually more dangerous than breaking out of it?" The debate continued through the afternoon and into the evening. Pizza was ordered around 6:00 p.m., though neither Whitney nor Clive ate much. The A&R executives eventually excused themselves, sensing that this needed to be a private conversation. As night fell over Manhattan, two legends sat across from each other, both exhausted, both dug into their positions, neither willing to back down. It was nearly 9:00 p.m. when Whitney made a proposal. "Let me play you 3 more songs, not from the album I showed you, 3 songs I've been holding back." Clive, tired but still engaged, nodded. Whitney walked to the stereo and inserted a different demo tape. These 3 songs were different from the first batch. They still had the authentic, raw quality Whitney was fighting for, but they were more melodic, more accessible. They represented a middle ground between the Whitney of the past and the Whitney she wanted to become. As the first of these songs played, Whitney watched Clive's face carefully. She saw something change in his expression. His fingers stopped tapping. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, just listening. When all 3 songs had finished, he opened his eyes and looked at Whitney with an expression she couldn't quite read. "These are different," he said finally. These are actually quite good." What followed was the most honest conversation Whitney and Clive had ever had. Away from the posturing, away from the power dynamics, they talked about fear. Clive admitted that he was afraid of losing control, afraid that if Whitney succeeded without following his formula, it would mean everything he had believed about the music business was wrong. Whitney admitted that she was afraid too, afraid that if she didn't make this change, she would lose herself completely in the machinery of fame. They talked about the music industry's history of artists who had tried to reinvent themselves. Some had succeeded brilliantly. Others had crashed and burned. They talked about Whitney's legacy and what she wanted to be remembered for. They talked about the difference between evolution and abandonment of everything that had made her special. Finally, around midnight, they reached an agreement. Whitney would record an album that represented her true artistic vision, but it would be a carefully crafted blend of the raw authenticity she craved and the musical excellence that Clive insisted upon. She would work with the hip-hop and R&B producers she wanted, but Clive would have input on which tracks made the final album. She would have creative control over her lyrics and vocal delivery, but Clive would ensure the production quality met Arista's standards. Most importantly, they agreed that the first single would be carefully chosen to prepare fans for the evolution in Whitney's sound without shocking them so completely that they rejected it. This single would serve as a bridge between old Whitney and new Whitney. It was a compromise, but it was a compromise both of them could live with. As Whitney prepared to leave that night, Clive walked her to the elevator. "You know," he said, "in 15 years, you've never challenged me like this." Whitney smiled tiredly. "In 15 years. I've never needed to. The album that proved everyone wrong. The album that resulted from that A-Tower meeting was My Love Is Your Love, released in November 1998. It was unlike anything Whitney had done before, incorporating hip-hop production, R&B grooves, and a rawness in Whitney's vocals that revealed new dimensions of her artistry. The first single, Heartbreak Hotel, featuring Faith Evans and Kelly Price, was the perfect bridge track. It had the R&B edge Whitney wanted, but maintained enough melodic sophistication to satisfy traditional Whitney fans. When Heartbreak Hotel was released, music critics were stunned. This wasn't the Whitney Houston they knew. This was something new, something more contemporary, something that finally allowed glimpses of the real woman behind the carefully constructed image. The song entered the Billboard Hot 100 and climbed steadily, eventually reaching number 2. More importantly, it received heavy rotation on urban radio stations that had never played Whitney's music before. The success of Heartbreak Hotel proved that Whitney had been right. There was an audience hungry to hear her authentic voice. When the full album dropped, it debuted at number 13 on the Billboard 200, her lowest debut position ever. Clive's fears seemed confirmed, but then something remarkable happened. The album didn't drop down the charts like most albums do. It climbed. Week after week, it moved up, driven by word of mouth and the strength of multiple successful singles. My Love Is Your Love eventually sold over 11 million copies worldwide, becoming one of Whitney's best-selling albums. More significantly, it introduced her to a new generation of fans who had grown up on hip-hop and R&B and had dismissed her earlier work as too mainstream, too safe. Critics praised the album for showing artistic growth and authenticity. At the 1999 Grammy Awards, Whitney performed It's Not Right But It's Okay, one of the album's most raw and personal tracks, and received a standing ovation. Backstage at the Grammys, Whitney and Clive shared a moment. I still think we took an unnecessary risk, Clive said with a slight smile. Whitney laughed. And I still think it was necessary. Clive nodded. But you were right about something. This album has given you something you didn't have before, credibility as an artist, not just as a voice. It was the closest thing to an admission of error that Clive would ever give, and Whitney knew it was as meaningful as any apology. The impact of that A-Tower meeting extended far beyond just one album. It fundamentally changed the relationship between Whitney and Clive. They were no longer simply mentor and student, or even label executive and artist. They had become creative partners who challenged each other, disagreed with each other, and ultimately made each other better. In subsequent years, Whitney would point to My Love Is Your Love as the album that saved her creatively. If I hadn't fought for that record, she later said in an interview, I don't know if I would have continued making music. I was suffocating under the weight of being perfect all the time. The album's success also influenced how other established artists approached their careers. It showed that evolution wasn't career suicide, that taking risks could actually revitalize a career rather than end it. For Clive Davis, the experience was equally transformative. He later admitted in his autobiography that Whitney's challenge had forced him to examine his own assumptions about the music business. I realized I had become so focused on protecting what we had built that I was preventing growth, he wrote. Whitney taught me that sometimes the artist sees things the executive can't. This realization influenced how he worked with other artists in his roster, giving them more creative freedom and trusting their instincts more than he had before. The conference room where that meeting took place became something of a legend at Arista Records. Staff members would point it out to visitors as the room where Whitney Houston fought for her soul and won. Years later, when the building was renovated, that conference room was left exactly as it had been, preserved as a reminder of what can happen when artists fight for their truth. Whitney's journey with My Love Is Your Love also highlighted an important truth about the music industry. The gatekeepers, even the most talented and well-intentioned ones, don't always know best. Sometimes artists need to trust their own instincts, even when it means going against the advice of people who have never been wrong before. Sometimes growth requires conflict. Sometimes the only way forward is through disagreement and into compromise. When Whitney passed away in 2012, Clive Davis spoke at her funeral. In his eulogy, he referenced that meeting, though he didn't go into details. Whitney and I didn't always agree, he said, his voice breaking with emotion. But she taught me that disagreement born from passion and conviction is a gift, not a problem. She challenged me to be better, and I hope I did the same for her. Those who knew about the A-Tower battle understood the depth of what Clive was saying. The story of Whitney's fight for My Love Is Your Love resonates because it's not just about one album or one artist. It's about every creative person who has ever been told to stay in their lane, to not rock the boat, to be grateful for success, and not ask for growth. It's about the courage it takes to risk everything you've built in pursuit of something more authentic. Whitney could have easily continued making safe, commercially successful albums for the rest of her career. She had already achieved legendary status. She had nothing left to prove in terms of commercial success. But she understood something profound. Success without authenticity eventually becomes a prison. The golden cage is still a cage, no matter how beautiful. The 8 hours Whitney and Clive spent in that conference room represent every difficult conversation artists must have when they decide to evolve. It represents the fear executives feel when formulas that have always worked suddenly need to change. It represents the negotiation between artistic vision and commercial reality that happens behind closed doors every day in the music industry. But more than anything, it represents the power of respectful disagreement. Whitney and Clive didn't destroy their relationship through that conflict. They strengthened it by working through their differences and finding a solution that honored both perspectives. That's the real lesson of this story. Change doesn't require burning bridges. It requires building new ones while keeping the old ones strong enough to support you if you need to walk back across them. Today, My Love Is Your Love stands as testament to what can happen when artists fight for their truth and mentors learn to trust their students' instincts. Every song on that album carries the echo of that 8-hour meeting, the passion, the frustration, the fear, and ultimately the courage to take a risk on authenticity. When you listen to Whitney's voice on tracks like It's Not Right, But It's Okay, or the title track, My Love Is Your Love, you're hearing the sound of an artist who fought for the right to be herself and won. The album proved that Whitney Houston was not just a voice. She was an artist with vision, courage, and the determination to grow even when growth was risky. And perhaps most importantly, it proved that sometimes the best thing a mentor can do is step back, listen to their student's perspective, and admit that maybe, just maybe, the student has become wise enough to chart her own course.